Hi, everyone. Happy Monday to you all. I'm really excited to get started on the next theory in our self concept series. If you remember, what we're talking about right now is what are the different ways that we answer the question, who am I? How do we define our self concept? How do we create our self concept? And so, first, we learned about social comparison theory. And this next theory is called social identity theory. So, we're going to walk through a couple slides that explain social identity theory in a little more depth. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain what social identity theory is. You should be able to differentiate between personal characteristics and social role characteristics. And you should also be able to define independent self-control and interdependent self-control. Okay? So I'm going to start with the story about Henry Tajfel. Henry Tajfel fought in World War II. He was captured by German soldiers during the war, and he was a Polish-born Jew who voluntarily joined the French army. When they asked him who he was, he had a choice to obviously he could come out and say completely who he was, but if you remember your history, that would have been a very dangerous choice. He did admit to them that he was Jewish. However, he said that he was a French citizen rather than a Polish-born Jewish person, and that ultimately saved his life. And so Henry went on to become a social psychologist, and he suggested that we have two categories that make up the self, or who we are. Okay, so the first category is our personal characteristics, things that are personal to us and that we would use to identify ourselves, like serious, funny, grumpy, tall, or rich. Okay, he also suggested that the other half of that is our social role characteristics. So these are things or roles that we play in society, like son or mother, musician, Catholic, or accountant. So you can kind of see how that first group is a little more individualized to you and it maybe describes you, whereas the second group more of defines you. Okay, these are the roles that we play, and given each of those roles, we behave and act in a certain way as is expected of the role that we're playing. So, overall, social identity theory states that our self concept is composed of two parts. There's our personal identity, okay, and then that's our personal characteristics. We also have a social identity that is based on social role characteristics. So, when we think about social roles, we can think about society and the way that we interact with systems, but also the way that we interact with each other. So, my example for personal are patient, organized, generous. My example for social roles is African American, Protestant, and heterosexual. So with each of those three things, there is a role, right? There's a way that I act and live and behave based on that social role. If you remember when we talked about social constructs right before we left for the closure, that is more of what I'm talking about. So those social identities that we take on as a result of some structure that we're placed into. So one example of a self, okay, is the regional self. That's one potential identity that we can take on as a social identity. And when we think about regional self, these are regional affiliations, and they influence how we perceive not only ourselves but also how we perceive other people. Okay, so Roy Baumeister, he pointed out that names can tell us where people are from. So we have Leonardo da Vinci, which translated means Leonardo from Vinci. Okay, so it's his name and then the region where he's from. If you go to World War II cemeteries in France, you'll see that people are buried first in groups by country, and then they're also buried in groups by region. So it even gets so specific to like the Loire Valley or Normandy, right? Or it separates them first country, and then it gets even more specific so as to suggest that the people in that specific region, even though they're all French, within their region, they're very different. Okay, and there was research done in 2000 about perception of United States or different states within our country, and it found that people from Massachusetts are seen as intelligent but also snobbish. People from Iowa are seen as hardworking but also hicks. People from Georgia are seen as hospitable but racist, and people from New York are seen as ambitious but rude. Okay? And so each state people from Iowa are going to look at people from New York in a certain way, and then vice versa. And then they are going to have their own identity within their own state. You could even argue that we see this play out within one state. Think about Washington. There's a big difference between east side, right, like Bellevue, Issaquah, and then if you go more south, like Kent and Renton. We also see a divide with the mountains. So, like the east side of Washington State is very different from the west side of Washington State, whether you talk about politics or even just the way that they act and the cultures that they kind of derive from. Whereas you might see more of what you would associate with country or southern on the east side and a lot more urban on the west side. Although, if you go north and south of Seattle, you actually see quite different people. Whereas the further south you go from Seattle, a little more closer to eastern Washington you get. But nonetheless, you understand this idea that not only am I an individual within my country and my state, but even within the area of my state where I live, that differentiates me from someone else. Another example of regional self, the NFL draft just happened, and people get really excited about players from their school going, right? Even more so excited than players in general going. And so someone from WSU got drafted, and that really got me excited. But also, I get excited when anyone from the Pac 12, so the conference that all of the schools kind of on the west side, so Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Oregon, California, Washington, those states all make up one athletic conference and they compete against each other. And I feel good and happy when anyone from the Pac 12 is drafted because it means it looks good for our conference, right? It looks good for our region overall. So that's another example of how regional self kind of says something about who we are because I think players from the Pac 12 are very different than players in the SEC or the ACC. Aside from the regional self, we also have the cultural self. And so the cultural self is usually kind of a hidden identity, but it becomes identifiable when we encounter a culture different from us. Okay. So within this photo, you can see three examples of cultural selves coming into conflict with other people's selves. So in each of their respective cultures, what they're wearing or doing might be normal to them, but if you swap them and put them in someone else's culture, it would be very normal. The first photo we see, very modest, protective clothing versus someone who is showing more leg and more back and more arms, right? And within those respective cultures, that might be seen as normal and probably not even recognized. However, when you swap or when they encounter, they clearly see a difference between each other. The image in the middle is another one that shows, right? To each of them, the other person is a freak, right? For different reasons. One is more colorful, more kind of expressive, while the other is more suit and tie, right? And so within each of their cultures, what they're wearing is normal. But when they encounter each other, it's very different. And you only know that it's different or yours is different when you see someone who is not abiding by your culture. And the last example is my favorite, football, right? Whenever the NFL ends their season with the Super Bowl, they say world champion New England Patriots, world champion Seattle Seahawks. And it's like, it's kind of hard to say world champion because we're the only place that plays football this way. Whereas in like the rest of the world, football is referring to soccer, what we call soccer, right? And so if you had a tournament between the US and England, said this is a football tournament, the English would bring a soccer ball and the Americans would bring a football. And you could see that culture clash. Okay? So we also see how the ideal self can change depending on culture. Okay. And so we have this idea of self-construal or self-construction, right? And you can either have an independent self-construal or an interdependent self-construal. So independent meaning by yourself alone. That means your self is based on your own personal qualities. Whereas an interdependent means you're dependent on something else. So your ideal self is based on social qualities. And a lot of it has to do with your relationships with others. So if we see these two cultures, Western and Asian, we can see in the Western culture, United States, Britain, etc., we can see ideas about autonomy, ideas about individualism, independence, and assertiveness. And if we go more East Asian cultures like Japan, We can see relatedness, collectivism, interdependence, and self-effacement. So, we're a rugged individualist, a kind of self-starter who just worked on their own to work their way up. That might be really praised in the United States, whereas in Japan, that person might be seen as rude or insensitive. Okay, and so we can see how, depending on what your culture thinks is important, that will decide whether your ideal self is based on your own qualities or if your ideal self is based on social qualities. So, to summarize this, social identity theory describes the self as a mixture of personal and social identities, so that we have these two separate identities that form to make us. And our region and culture can impact how we define ourself. So, as you think about this, kind of think, if we go back to this table, right, think about the response to the coronavirus, right, COVID-19. How did these identities, how did these qualities or characteristics, can you see difference in the ways countries have responded to this based on these things, right? Because I would argue that you could see a difference between how the United States is responding to how some other countries are responding to the coronavirus. And I think it has a lot to do with the values in each society. So as I close today, I know this video is a little longer, about 11 minutes. So what I want to do is make the critical thinking challenge due tomorrow so that you really stick to that 25-minute limit. That gives you about 14 minutes today and then the full 25 tomorrow, so you can get a really good response in to the critical thinking question that aligns with social identity theory. So I will see you again on Wednesday. So you take tomorrow to work on that critical thinking challenge, get it submitted, and then we'll go over our last theory of self-concept